With Minnesota's economy continuing to outperform the United States, our revenues are growing and allowing us to completely pay back our statutory IOUs and still have a projected $825 million balance by the end of June 2015. Now, this forecast shouldn't be mistaken for money in the bank. We're still only in the 5th month of a 2-year budget. But one thing is clear. With this forecast, we will have completely paid back our school shifts and replenished our reserves.
Some additional positive information about Minnesota's economy showing strength is that our unemployment rate has fallen. It typically runs below the U.S. rate, but now that gap between the U.S. rate and Minnesota's rate is larger than it usually is. In addition to the lower unemployment rate, a very encouraging sign for Minnesota's labor market is that first-time claims for jobless benefits have fallen to levels not observed in more than a decade. And other leading labor market indicators, so indicators that suggest improvement in the labor market, are also looking strong.
These numbers are solid, though not spectacular. And the reason I say that is sort of 2 reasons. One is that obviously, as in the past, the spending numbers don't include any discretionary inflation for them, so while we see a structural balance here, that factor isn't included. The other is simply that there's uncertainty in this forecast as usual. And the last time we had this kind of budget scenario was more than a decade ago. And while you didn't see any dark, stormy clouds at that point in time, 2 years later, we had a deficit. So these are benchmarks, these are planning estimates, and it's certainly good news that shows we're on the right direction, but I don't want to overplay that too much.
Today's forecast will trigger the immediate repayment of the final $246 million we owe our schools. It will also permit the elimination of yet another leftover gimmick, $15 million owed to the Airports Fund, which will leave $825 million remaining from the $1.086 billion forecasted balance. This news will no doubt launch a blizzard of legislative proposals to reduce taxes and increase expenditures. I point out that there will be another budget forecast in just 3 months, which will update today's projections. I will await that forecast before I submit my final proposed budget revisions to the legislature. If this forecast holds, however, I expect to propose the elimination of all 3 business-to-business sales taxes, effective April 1st, 2014, at a cost of $231 million for the rest of the biennium. My other priority is a tax cut for middle-income Minnesotans by, for example, conforming to all the federal tax cuts, which would cost about $205 million for this biennium.
The forecast shows how the honest budget passed by the DFL legislature and the governor that did not include accounting shifts or gimmicks has created the confidence and stability necessary for our strong growth that we've seen here in Minnesota. The economy continues to build momentum, and the strong economic forecast today confirms that the structurally balanced budget passed by the legislature has put the state on stable economic footing for the first time in a long number of years.
A statistic that I'd like to remind you of that we haven't heard today is 49% of Minnesota families, or excuse me, 49% of Minnesotans are either unemployed or underemployed. And that's an important number. What it means is Minnesota families are making less money than they did prior to the recession. So now isn't the time for a victory lap. We can't look behind us and say that the finish line is behind us. I don't know if we're even halfway through the race yet. But Minnesota families deserve a full economic recovery. And unfortunately, while we do have a bit of a budget surplus right now, Democrats took $2.1 billion, a historic tax increase from hardworking Minnesotans. And Minnesotans, frankly, don't care how much money the government has to spend. They care how much their family has to spend. And right now, because of the tax increases that the Democrats put in place over the last session, Minnesota families have less money to spend.
I think certainly it's great news that we have a positive forecast. We've had several now in the past 2 or 3 years. That is good. I'm not so sure that's a good news for the citizens of the state who are obviously taking out of their budget to provide those additional revenues to our budget. The reason for this graphic here is simply to point out this is a 2-year to 2-year comparison. The last 2 years are actual numbers. On the right side is the forecasted numbers. And all we're trying to get at here is the point. that we've said all along, that it is the economic activity outside of the Capitol that is responsible for the growth of the economy. And when you have growing economy, you get growing revenues.